I have in my hands a very special package with a very special Bible inside. This is the one and only Newrome Press Bible, which is newly released. And this is a long-awaited Bible, borderline mythical, because some of us have been waiting literally years for this Bible, and we're beginning to think that it doesn't really exist. But it does exist, and it's right here in my hands, and we're going to unbox it together in this video. Now, interestingly, I did get this Bible a couple weeks ago, but it was defective. One of the pages had been folded back and sewn into the spine, but Newrome Press was very generous to quickly respond to my inquiry and replace the Bible. So I have the replacement here. We'll be unboxing it today, and I'll be talking a little bit about why this Bible is so important for the Orthodox community today, and also for the wider audience, anyone who's interested in Bibles or patristics or biblical studies, Old Testament studies. This Bible is actually important for everybody. Don't forget to subscribe for future content on the Bible and Orthodox Christianity, and hit that like button if you find this video helpful. Without any further ado, let's go ahead and bust this box open and check out the Newrome Press Bible. And there you can see the beautiful box in which this Bible is contained. And these are 4 icons on there. These could be prophets or maybe ancestors of Christ. I'm not sure. But on the back, there are 4 icons of the gospel writers, which is pretty cool. You can see the Holy Bible on the side and the Newrome Press logo there at the bottom. Let's continue and check out the Bible itself. Now, by the way, one comment I wanted to make about this is when I got the very first Bible, the one that had a defect in it, it actually had a beanie in there, which is pretty cool. So if you buy the Bible yourself, you might get a little goodie in there with the Bible. I think they didn't put that in this one because it's a replacement one, but that's okay. I don't need the beanie. I just need the Bible, and I've got it right here. Let's continue. Okay, let's see. And there it is, the beautiful Newrome Press Bible. Look at that. Beautiful manufactured leather cover with the root of Jesse icon in the front. Now this icon is a tree, and on the tree are icons of Christ's ancestors. So this is connecting the New Testament and the Old Testament together, showing that Christ is the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies. There are also prophets on this icon. It's a very appropriate icon for this Bible because this Bible contains both the New Testament and the Old Testament. So we have all of the Old Testament prophesying Christ and the New Testament fulfilling those prophecies, and this icon is tying them all together. Very beautiful and a very good selection for a cover, if you ask me. On the side, it says the Holy Bible, and it has the Newrome Press name on the bottom, and it says Reader's Edition there at the top. Okay, so this is the manufactured leather version of the Bible with no zipper. There are 4 versions of this Bible which exist. There's the manufactured leather, no zipper, manufactured leather with zipper, and then there's a lambskin with zipper and lambskin without zipper. And as I understand, the lambskin was a limited edition that came out for a limited amount of time and are no longer available. But as of today, I believe you can still get the manufactured leather version today, either in the non-zippered like this one or the zippered version. This Bible is absolutely gorgeous. When you look at how the Bible is laid out in its text block, it's got 2 columns and it's colored. So some of the graphics or the decorations in the Bible are actually colored, and it's very beautiful. This is probably the most beautiful Bible I've ever looked at when reading the text block. You can tell they put a lot of thought into making this Bible very beautiful. And I think that the beauty invites you to read the scriptures. I think that's very important. And that's a really big selling point on this Bible. I think if you enjoy reading a beautiful Bible, this is an excellent Bible for you to read. So let's talk a little bit about the contents of this Bible and why they're so important for Christians today. So the Old Testament translation in this Bible is the Lexham English Septuagint. It's a reprint of a translation that already exists, And this is the Lexham English Septuagint. You may be already familiar with it. The New Testament is a reprint of the Eastern Orthodox Bible New Testament. That's this pocket version, if you're familiar with this version of the New Testament. This is also published by Newrome Press. It's a translation only of the New Testament, and it's pocket-sized. But there's another publication of it here, which you may be familiar with. It's the exact same translation that's featured in the Newrome Press Bible, the EOB, or Eastern Orthodox Bible New Testament. And this is a Reader's Edition Bible, which means it doesn't have verse numberings. It has line numberings, and it's double columned. So this is it's designed to be a reader's Bible that you read and you experience how the early Christians read the Bible. Of course, verse numberings were added later to the Bible, and they really wanted to immerse you in the experience of reading the Bible like the early church did, which was just reading the text itself without dividing it and cutting it apart with verses. So for some people, that will be a pro because it really helps you to have a good experience reading the scriptures just for reading them. But that might be a con for some people who are using the scriptures in apologetics, who are looking for specific verses, referring to specific verses. You might have to find a verse here and then find it in another Bible with the verse numberings to identify which verse that is. So just keep that in mind with this Bible. Now, the manufactured leather versions have the root of Jesse icon on them. The lambskin editions have a cross on them. That cross is from a 13th century church in Serbia. So it's based in the Orthodox tradition. It's a beautiful cross. The Bible's width is 7.7 inches by 10.12 inches. So that's also known as B5. So it's a rather large Bible. It's not, I'd say it's a little bit larger than a standard Bible. And also, in addition to the text block, in the back, it contains 42 maps, which is very cool. When you're reading the Bible, you hear a lot of geographic terms. You can flip to the back and see the geography of that passage of the Bible. It's very helpful when reading and studying the scriptures. Now, just for the record, this is technically not a complete Bible translated by Orthodox Christians. The Old Testament was produced by Lexham Press, and Lexham Press is a Protestant evangelical publishing house. That doesn't mean that the translation is bad. It's just something to keep in mind when using this Bible to understand where the Old Testament text came from. It's also important to keep in mind that the Old Testament and New Testament were translated from two different sources. The Old Testament is translated by Lexham Press. The New Testament was translated by one Orthodox priest named Father Laurent Kleineweg. So let's take a moment to talk about what this Bible is and is not. This is a Bible with an Old Testament that follows the Septuagint more strictly than the Orthodox Study Bible. So the Orthodox Study Bible has certain passages in its Old Testament which actually align with the Masoretic text, not the Septuagint. This Bible will be following very strictly the Septuagint without any Masoretic interference whatsoever. So that's one of the positives of having the Lexham English Septuagint in an Orthodox Bible. It's following the Septuagint very closely. Now, this is also the first single-volume Bible with a translation of the Septuagint paired with a translation of the patriarchal text in one volume. There is no other Bible on the market with that particular combo. And that's very significant for Orthodox Christians because the Septuagint and the patriarchal text are our favorite texts for the Old Testament and the New Testament in the Orthodox life, in the life of the church. Those align with the texts that are being read in the churches and used by the church fathers. The patriarchal text comes from the lectionaries of the Byzantine church, so it's very much rooted and grounded and consistent with the Orthodox tradition. And that's very interesting for Orthodox Christians and valuable because it's a Bible from our text, from our Bible as Orthodox Christians. The Septuagint, the patriarchal text, which is from the lectionaries of the Byzantine church. But it's also interesting for Protestants for its text-critical value. So anybody who's interested in text-critical studies, you can have on one hand the Masoretic text, and you can compare that reading with the Septuagintal reading. If that kind of thing interests you, this Bible is very interesting. You might want to consider studying it side by side with a Masoretic text translation like the New King James Version, to see how the two different texts read. The Septuagint, as we know, is translated from a very ancient version of the Hebrew Old Testament, much more ancient than our extant Masoretic text manuscripts. So it represents a now lost Hebrew text tradition, very important for text critical studies. And similarly, the New Testament is the translation of the patriarchal text, which is interesting for Protestants who are interested in New Testament text critical studies, who love to collect different translations from different source texts. Of course, we have the Textus Receptus, we have the Nestle Aland text, we have the Peshitta text, the Vulgate text. This as another text for study and comparison, a translation of the patriarchal text. So if you're interested in New Testament textual studies, this gives you access to what the content of the Orthodox patriarchal text contains. So let's talk a little bit about the Lexham English Septuagint. The first version of the Lexham English Septuagint came in 2012. There was a second edition that came out in 2019. It's produced by Newrome Press, which is a Protestant evangelical publisher. But they did an excellent job on this translation, and it's very acceptable for Orthodox Christians because they tried very hard to keep it strictly adhering to the Septuagint text. So they weren't recreating what they believed was the original reading. They were simply following the Septuagint as best they could. So that's why for us as Orthodox Christians it's very valuable, because it's a one-to-one reflection of our scriptures in our tradition, the Septuagint tradition, which you hear in all of the Orthodox liturgical readings. The Lexham English Septuagint was produced by many translators, and it was headed by Dr. Randall Tan. Now, Dr. Randall Tan is a linguist, and he works for the Asia Bible Society. Before joining the Asia Bible Society, he was an assistant professor of biblical studies at Kentucky Christian University in Grayson. He also served as a faculty member at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary and Spalding University in Louisville, Kentucky, and as assistant editor of the Southern Baptist Journal of Theology. So that gives you an idea of the scholarship that went into this. Of course, these are evangelicals, Protestants, but they are scholars, and they were translating this faithfully as best they could. Now, it's also noteworthy that one of the contributing editors for the Lexham English Septuagint is Michael Heiser, who you may be familiar with, especially if you're Protestants who are interested in Old Testament studies. But his input, I think, is very valuable for Old Testament textual studies, and he was one of the contributing editors on this Bible, on the Old Testament Lexham English Septuagint. Now, some computer software was used in producing this translation, which probably helped to speed the process by. Of course, it would be a monumental task to translate the whole Old Testament by yourself, so they relied on a little bit of computer software to help in the process, but it ultimately passed through human editors in the end. I just want to throw that out there, if it's part of the translation history of that Old Testament version. Of course, the key selling point in the Lexham English Old Testament, which is featured in this Newrome Press Bible, is that it is a pure Septuagint translation that follows it without any intermingling with the Masoretic text. Now, from the introduction of the Lexham English Septuagint, I read the following. It says, "Every effort was made to render the Greek in its own right, with no eye to the Hebrew at all. The Lexham English Septuagint is an attempt to answer the question, how would this text have been read, understood, and experienced by a 4th century Greek-speaking Gentile Christian?" So they were really going for a early Christian experience of reading the Old Testament. And that's why it's particularly valuable for Christians today, because it's a Bible from our own Christian heritage. This is a Bible that the early Christians would have been reading. This is what they would have been hearing in their services. And I think they've done an excellent job at producing in the English language access to the average Christian to reading the early Christians' Old Testament, the Septuagintal text. And this is the Old Testament featured in this Newrome Press Bible. So it's very exciting for Orthodox Christians and for all Christians who are interested in the Christian heritage, the patristic heritage, the early Christian heritage that is all going to be reflected in this version of the Bible. It is truly a Bible from the Christian tradition. Now, the base Greek text behind the Lexham English Septuagint, which is featured in this Newrome Press Bible, is the edition produced by Dr. Henry Sweet, and that is a diplomatic edition of the Septuagint, which means it's produced from a manuscript directly. So it's not a critical edition, which is trying to reproduce a theoretical original, but Dr. Sweet's edition of the Septuagint follows the word-by-word text of Codex Vaticanus, And where text is lacking, the text is supplied from other manuscripts which are comparable, like Codex Sinaiticus or Codex Alexandrinus. So what that means for us as Bible readers is every word in this Bible, in its Old Testament, corresponds to an actual word in a manuscript from the early church. So it has a direct connection to an actual early Christian Bible, which is very cool, and especially within an Orthodox ethos, that this text was not produced in a laboratory, so to say, of text critical scholars, but it really reflects an actual early Christian text. So that's what it means that it's a diplomatic edition of the Septuagint. Now that will be a pro for some people, could also be a con for some people who like critical text, who want to see a reconstructed Septuagint version. There are critical editions, and there are translations of those critical editions, like the Netz translation of the Septuagint. That is a translation of the Ralph's edition, which is a semi-critical edition of the Septuagint, and sometimes it translates from the Göttingen edition of the Septuagint, which is a fully critical edition of the Septuagint. But for the purposes of this Bible, with their translation principles, they were really looking to ground the text in an actual early Christian manuscript and reproduce the experience of reading the Bible as an ancient Christian. I think they made an excellent choice by going with Sweet's edition of the Septuagint, and I think Newrome Press made an excellent choice by going with the Lexham English Septuagint for their Old Testament. Now, regarding the style of the translation, it is not consistently literal or dynamic. Okay, so the Septuagint, depending on which book, may be more or less literal. So the second edition of the Lexham English Septuagint tried to mimic the translation style of each Septuagint book individually. So if the Greek is very literal in a particular book of the Septuagint, the English text in that second edition of the Lexham English Septuagint is trying to actually mimic the experience of a Greek reader reading that text. And so it's not the case that this Old Testament is fully literal or fully dynamic. It sort of fluctuates depending on the quality of the translation of the Greek text behind it. So that's something interesting to keep in mind as you're reading this. That is not the case with the first edition of the Lexham English Septuagint, which is strictly literal. And the Newrome Press Bible is using the second edition of the Lexham English Septuagint. So for some people that will be a pro, again, because it's the experience of the early church when they were reading the Old Testament. That's what they would have felt when they were reading these books. For others, they might think, okay, I like literal translations. I want the whole thing to be literal. That's also fair, but just keep in mind when you're reading this, the translation principle is that they wanted to mimic the literalness of the Greek behind the English. This translation also uses English names in it. It doesn't use transliterated Greek names, like, for example, in the Netz Bible. So you will see names like Isaiah in here, not Isaias, because they're using the English forms of these names. I think this was an excellent choice because these are the names that we're familiar with. And so if you have read any Bible translation before in the English language, you can pick this Newrome Press Bible up and be very comfortable with the names that you're reading there. You'll know exactly who they are talking about. Now, regarding the books of the Old Testament that are in this Newrome Press Bible, it is following the contents in Sweet's edition. So there are extra books that you're not used to seeing in the Bible. Of course, we have all of the books of the Protestant Old Testament canon. We also have all the books of the Catholic Old Testament canon, plus a few extras. 3rd and 4th Maccabees are included in this Bible, the Book of Enoch, the Psalms of Solomon, the Odes. Okay, now these books don't necessarily reflect the Orthodox Bible canon. They were put in there following the contents of Sweet's edition, and Sweet was simply putting everything in there because he wanted to have a complete, exhaustive collection of books from the early church, which may or may not have been considered part of the Septuagintal corpus. Okay, so when reading this Bible, you're looking at the table of contents. It doesn't necessarily mean that every single book there is fully canonical in the Orthodox Church. But it's good to have those books because they are used in the life of the church. They were read by early Christians and church fathers. So I think it is a good thing to have them in there. We should just be careful not to base our understanding of the canon off the table of contents in this particular Bible, because that wasn't their purpose. Okay, so the purpose was just to simply have the collection of books which were valuable scriptures for Christians. They may not necessarily all be fully canonical within the view of the Orthodox Church. Now, every Old Testament book is the Septuagint version, which means Jeremiah will be the Septuagintal, slightly shorter version of Jeremiah. Daniel will be the larger version with Bel and the Dragon and Susanna. And Esther will be the longer version of Esther. It also features both versions of Daniel, so you may be familiar with the fact that Daniel has two Greek transmission lines. It has what's called the Old Greek transmission line and the Theodotian or the Theta transmission line, and this Bible contains both of those, so you can compare them. It also has two versions of Tobit with the same reason. There are two different Greek transmission lines, and both of those are featured in this Bible. Now, the Greek behind the Old Testament text in the Newrome Press Bible is the Sweet edition, which was published in 1904 by Henry Sweet. It's also known as the shorter or the smaller Cambridge edition of the Septuagint, and this is a diplomatic edition of the Septuagint, not a critical edition, but that can be a positive thing because, again, it's grounded in real, actual early Christian manuscripts. The Sweet edition also has an excellent apparatus. So if you're using this Newrome Press Bible in your studies and you want to see the Greek behind it, you want to look at Dr. Henry Sweet's edition because that's the actual Greek behind the English in this Bible. And there's an apparatus there where you can check variants. So even though it's not a critical edition, you can still look at the apparatus if you're concerned about any variants within the major witnesses of the Septuagint tradition. And it's a good idea to check the apparatus because, again, it's not a critical edition, and every time you're reading this, you are possibly encountering a variant reading of the text within the Septuagint tradition. So sometimes the text in this Bible will disagree with the Orthodox Study Bible or the Netz Bible or Brenton, because there are variants in the Septuagint tradition. So it's good to keep in mind that you're reading Codex Vaticanus's content, which may be slightly different sometimes than Codex Alexandrinus's or Codex Sinaiticus's witness of the Septuagint reading. So if you're using it for study, I highly recommend checking the apparatus in Sweet's edition. You can also check it in Ralph's edition if you have that to check for variants. But scholars generally agree that Codex Vaticanus is a very, very good witness of the Septuagintal text without too much influence from other textual traditions. Now, some of the major pros of this Old Testament in the Newrome Press Bible is it's an Old Testament grounded and rooted in the Christian tradition. This is a Christian Bible that was used by Christians for centuries, since the very beginning. The Septuagint, as you know, was the primary version of the Old Testament quoted from the New Testament writers. It's also the edition most often used by the Church Fathers and the ecumenical councils, and it's grounded in ancient manuscript witnesses like Codex Vaticanus, which dates to the 4th century. So this is a patristic Bible. This is an early Christian Bible, an ecumenical council Bible. This is a Bible that you read when you're interested in reading within the historic life of the Christian church. It also includes books that are not featured in other Bibles, even Catholic Bibles like 4th Maccabees. And we know that the Church Fathers quoted from 4th Maccabees. They even gave homilies on 4th Maccabees. It's a great book to have, and a lot of people just don't have it because it's not featured in their Bibles. So while it may not be necessarily canonical at the same level as the other canonical books of the Bible, it is good that it's in here because it will be many people's first copy of 4th Maccabees to read, and it is a very important work in church history. It's also an excellent Bible for those interested in text critical studies. Again, if you're interested in Old Testament studies, Old Testament textual studies, it's great to have a nice and accurate, accessible translation of the Septuagint, which has no interference from the Masoretic text, by which you can compare the Masoretic reading in your King James or New King James or ESV or whatever. You can then side by side compare the textual traditions of those two versions. The English translation itself is very comfortable to read. I would say it's similar to reading an ESV. It runs very smoothly. It's very easy to understand. It uses contemporary English. So there are not going to be any problems when it comes to the actual quality of the English language itself in this translation. Now, regarding the cons of this Bible or potential cons, the publisher is a Protestant publisher. Now, that could be a problem for some people who are really big sticklers on having an Orthodox-only Bible. The Old Testament translation here is not necessarily produced by Orthodox hands. But again, I don't think that's a huge issue because of the translation principles which those translators were following. They were not mingling the Masoretic text with the text of the Septuagint. They were following the Septuagint very closely. So you know that this is following from the Orthodox tradition, which will align with the patristic tradition. So I think overall it's a very good translation. Now, one comment on that, sometimes the word choices are a little bit strange in my opinion. So for example, the word biblios, sometimes you see it translated as documents when really it means books. So I find the word document a little awkward for Old Testament books. You know, when you think about the Pentateuch scrolls in the temple, you don't really think of them as documents, even though you might see that word used in this translation. And because some of the names are from English, English is influenced by the Masoretic names, you will see some Masoretic influence on the names. So for example, the word Passover is used, not the word Pascha, and Passover, of course, is a translation of the Hebrew word, which is used for Passover, which means to pass over. But in Greek, they use a transliteration from Aramaic, Pascha, and a Greek reader would have seen the name Pascha, and they wouldn't have necessarily known that that meant Passover. But when you're reading this Bible, it says Passover, which seems to follow a little bit more the Hebrew Masoretic understanding, but that's coming through the English language. It's not necessarily coming because of the translation. Another example is Joshua. In Greek, Joshua is the same name as Jesus, but in English, of course, Joshua and Jesus are different names. So a Greek reader of the Old Testament would have seen the name Jesus in certain places in the Old Testament, and even in certain prophecies, which is very important for Christological prophecies. So that's also a little bit different. If you're reading it in English, you're going to be seeing the name Joshua, which seems to reflect more of an English tradition than an actual Greek tradition. But otherwise, the overall text itself is going to be following the Septuagint exactly. And the literalness may be a problem for some people who would say, I want a completely consistent literal translation. Not every book will be equally literal in the Old Testament version of this Bible. And that's, again, reflecting that Greek experience. Not every book in the Septuagint was equally literal. So they wanted to mimic that experience. That will be a pro for some people, but it could be a con for some as well. So let's talk about the New Testament translation. Again, the New Testament in the Newrome Press Bible is the EOB New Testament that's found in these versions. You can get these both online. They're still being published and readily available. Now, the EOB New Testament was translated by one Orthodox priest named Father Laurent Kleinawerk. And just a few quick notes on his bio. He was ordained into the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the USA in 2004. He was received into the Orthodox Church in America in 2007, and he served at St. Innocent Orthodox Church in Eureka, California from 2007 to 2024. It was there during that time that he produced the translation of the EOB New Testament. And in 2024, he moved to France and was released to the Archdiocese of Russian Orthodox Churches in Western Europe and is currently on leave. He has an academic degree in sacred theology from St. Sergius Orthodox Theological Institute in Paris. He has a master's degree in ecumenical studies from the Ukrainian Catholic University, a doctorate of science in the study of religion from the St. Gregory Nazianzen Institute, and a PhD in public health. He teaches theology, international administration, and global health at Euclid University, Euler Franeker Memorial University, and the Ukrainian Catholic University. So he certainly has the credentials and the experience as an Orthodox Christian and as a scholar to produce such a translation. Now, the translation that he produced, he describes it as formal equivalence. So it is a consistently literal translation of the New Testament, which the Orthodox tend to like because it connects us more closely with the original text that's in there. And we don't worry about making the text too obvious because we have the church fathers and the church services and councils to help us interpret some of those difficult passages. So the Orthodox generally like a literal translation. The EOB New Testament is very aware of modern textual criticism for the New Testament and is very focused on text critical studies. So the footnotes will tell you about key variants in the different editions of the New Testament. So the critical text, the Textus Receptus, and the patriarchal text, there are variants between those families, and some of the major differences will be marked in the footnotes. So the footnotes in the EOB New Testament are not pastoral, theological, patristic exhortations on the scripture. They're very much focused on the textual side of things, where they're focusing on the textual variants just to make you aware of them. Now, there are some things about the translation that I don't particularly like, and the main one is the translation of proskineo, which means to bow down or prostrate oneself. It's consistently translated as expressing adoration, and I don't particularly like that translation because the word proskineo is very important in Orthodox Christian theology. When it comes to the topic of worship and veneration of saints, proskineo is used for both worship and veneration. And in Greek, proskineo is very liquid and context dependent. So depending on the intent of the person doing the proskineo can determine whether or not it's an honorific bowing or if it's a worshipful adoration. And expressing adoration sounds too much like worship because in the Latin tradition, adoro means worship to God alone. So the translation is not perfect in my opinion, but overall, I think it's a very good translation. Just something to keep in mind, it is a translation, and you don't want to give up other translations as well as accountability partners when reading the New Testament. Now, the base text of the EOB New Testament featured in the Newrome Press Bible is the patriarchal text. Now, what is the patriarchal text? The patriarchal text is a Greek edition of the New Testament, which was produced in 1904 by the Patriarch of Constantinople. So a few facts about this text. It's a Byzantine type text, so it's going to be very similar to the Textus Receptus that you'll see in the New King James Version, in the King James Version, and the majority text will be very similar to the content of the patriarchal text. In fact, the patriarchal text is slightly closer to the majority text than it is to the Textus Receptus. It was produced under the ecumenical patriarch Constantine V and compiled from Byzantine manuscripts and lectionaries. So the editors of the patriarchal text compiled medieval Byzantine lectionaries and manuscripts and created a sort of critical edition from those texts in the patriarchal text. So it's a text that really reflects the life of the Byzantine church, the versions of the New Testament which were read and used in the churches throughout the Byzantine era. So it's a very faithful text to the tradition of the Orthodox Church. Of course, out of the Byzantine Church came all of our Slavic Orthodox churches and Greek Orthodox churches, so it's very much connected to the heritage of all Orthodox Christians. And the text is very much aiming at a faithful version of the New Testament, not reconstructing a theoretical original. So for Orthodox Christians, the perspective is slightly different than what some of our Protestant friends may be aiming for when producing a New Testament edition, where Protestants are always trying to reproduce the original. The Orthodox Christians are just asking a different question. What is the text used by the church? What is the text that was read in the church services throughout the historic Christian church? The result would be the patriarchal text, which is produced in this Bible. Again, it's very in line with the Old Testament version here, because the Old Testament is from the manuscripts of the Septuagint from the life of the church, and the New Testament is also from the manuscripts used in the lectionaries and the Bibles used in the Byzantine Empire. So this Bible is very much consistently cover to cover a reflection of the life of the living church. The scriptures that were used by the churches, that were read by the fathers and the councils, is a very faithful text to the Christian tradition. So the prose of the Newrome Press Bible's New Testament is it's a faithful New Testament to the life of the church, directly coming out of the readings of the historic Orthodox Church. So this is a New Testament edition whose content is truly orthodox. It's not produced by scholars trying to reproduce a critical text. It's not based off of one manuscript. It's based off of manuscripts that were actually used in the Church of Constantinople. And it's a great edition of the New Testament for those who are interested in New Testament studies, because the patriarchal text is a rare base text for New Testament translations. You could have 100 different translations. Most likely none of them would be from the patriarchal text. There's only a handful which exist on the market today. So for those who are interested in different variant readings and different editions of the New Testament, they're going to want to have on their shelf at least one translation of the patriarchal text, and this Bible would provide that need. The translation is very conservative in its values. There's not a lot of social issues that are being pushed into the text. It's very literal, very faithful, very translated with the mind mind of an Orthodox Christian. Now, some of the words, of course, I think could have been translated a little better, but overall, it's a very good and faithful conservative translation for Orthodox Christians. Now, some of the cons about the New Testament in the Newrome Press Bible is it was produced by one man, okay, and nobody is an infallible translator. So it may have been a little bit more accurate if it was translated by a committee of Orthodox translators. And so there might be a little bit of errors just because the number of translators was pretty small. But again, Father Laurent is very, very qualified to translate this. He has very good credentials. So overall, the mistakes are very, very small in my opinion. And if you're a person who wants a critical edition of the New Testament, you want that theoretical original, the patriarchal text and the EOB New Testament in the Newrome Press Bible is probably not the New Testament for you because again, it's answering a different question. It's not asking what did the original New Testament have? It's saying what is the New Testament used by the church? So if you are looking for reconstructing the original, probably not the best translation for you. But if you do want a Bible that reflects the life of the church, especially in Constantinople, where this translation is based on, then this is certainly an excellent translation to have. So all in all, I think this is an excellent Bible and is certainly a Bible that Orthodox Christians have been needing for a long time. A Bible directly out of the life of the church. Unlike the Orthodox Study Bible, the New Testament of this is from the patriarchal text, which is our text, and translated by an Orthodox priest. And unlike the Orthodox Study Bible, the Old Testament is strictly following the Septuagint. So if you're looking for a Bible that is patristic, that is early Christian, grounded in the Christian tradition, this is certainly the Bible for you. It's also a Bible for you if you love beautiful Bibles and you want an excellent Bible reading experience. And if you're interested in text critical studies for the Old Testament or the New Testament, overall, I think this is an excellent addition to the Orthodox Bible publication market, and I think they did an excellent job at producing it. So that's all for today. If you have any questions, please leave a comment below. I love hearing from you. Thank you for watching. If you found this helpful, hit that like button and subscribe for future content on the Bible and Orthodox Christianity. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.